What can you do as a tourist in Belfast? We've got all the facts because not only is Reza from Belfast, but he just spent the summer there. Welcome to...
Aprender inglés con Reza y Craig.
Hi, I'm Reza.
And my name's Craig.
And with 50 years of teaching between us, we'll help you improve your English and take it to the next level. How are you, Craig?
I'm very fine. You may have noticed that I'm trying to speak
Oh, very, very well, by the way.
with a Belfast accent.
Very, very convincing.
With a Belfast accent.
You did it really well.
That's because I've been copying you. This episode, we're speaking about Belfast and what you could do if you go as a tourist. You were there this summer.
Yeah, I've just come back after 2 months there. I often go in the summer to teach. A bit confusing. I go to Belfast to teach Chinese people. Because I go to the University of Ulster. Ulster is kind of another way of saying Northern Ireland, more or less. It's kind of the northern bit of Ireland. So I go to the University of Ulster, and foreign students who are going to start at the university in September there, they have to come for a summer course and improve their English first. And it's very funny because some of them hadn't done their homework before they arrive, and they just thought that everybody in Belfast is going to speak like everybody speaks on the British TV series that they know. But they're not, are they? Because they're going to Northern Ireland, and the accent and even some of the vocabulary in Northern Ireland is not the same as Manchester or London or Liverpool or Glasgow. So it shocks them when they arrive.
And do they say that to you in the class? Do they have problems understanding the accent and they say to you, hey, Reza, I can't understand the person in the shop?
Yeah, in a very innocent, naive way. It's very funny to say, teacher, my dictionary say, how are you? People say, how about ye? Which is how people say
About ye.
Not understanding. I say, yeah, it's the way people speak.
So we're going to give you some suggestions of things you can see and do in Belfast. But what are we doing before that?
First of all, we've got some feedback from Alberto from Australia. But just before we play that feedback, I'd like to thank Alberto for an email he sent me about Derry Girls. He said, have you seen Derry Girls? Derry Girls is a series which is set in Northern Ireland.
But not in Belfast.
Not in Belfast, in Derry. So Derry is the second kind of city of Northern Ireland. And yes, I had seen that series before, Alberto, and I'm very impressed that you're a fan of it because the accent is not easy to follow.
No, it's not. I've seen it and I recommend it because I think it's very funny. Although you may have to listen a few times because the accent is quite strong. So that's Derry Girls, which is available on Netflix.
And just before we listen to Alberto's feedback about something different, just to complicate things further, in Belfast, we know immediately when we meet someone from Derry because our accent is not the same. Mm-hmm. You people who are not from Northern Ireland, you probably wouldn't know, and you think, well, it's pretty much the same. But we know. Isn't it funny how locals from the area pick up on very, very, very fine details? A Derry accent is not the same as a Belfast accent.
I didn't know that.
And I immediately pick up on this. I have a colleague actually at the British Council who's from Derry. And as soon as he met me, he said, but you'd be from Belfast, wouldn't you? Because he knew from my accent. I said, all right, you're from Derry, I bet.
What's the distance between Derry and Belfast? How far is it?
About 100 miles at most, 90 miles, 100 miles maybe. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we do have an accent which we can see the difference between. Maybe you can, but we can. Can you imagine that? So Derry Girls, the Netflix series, they have a Derry accent, which is not quite the same as a Belfast accent.
Interesting. Well, before we get into Belfast, let's listen to Alberto, who is from Spain but living in Australia.
Hi, Rosa. Hi, Craig. This is Alberto from Australia. Craig, I love your Australian version you recorded a few podcasts ago. I have to say, the Aussie people, they speak really quick and they use a lot of abbreviations. There is a video on YouTube. It's called How to Speak Australian, Abbreviate Everything. And they say, for example, McDonald's, Macca's, breakfast, brekkie, mosquito, mussy. And they keep going with a lot of words that the Australian people reduce. It's very funny. It could be a good challenge for some people. Yeah, actually, this is what is going on here. They use a lot of abbreviation. Thanks for your last episode about vegetarians and vegans. It was really good. Craig wanted to double check about Vegemite, that as he said, it's a yeast spreadable product for savory sandwich. Indeed, you can find Vegemite here and another brand called Promite. Also, I think Reza said he likes it, but he is not a huge fan of it. I have the same opinion. By the way, Greg, you also can find in healthy shops a vegan chocolate version, which I have tried and it's really yummy, but to be honest, I prefer an old-style chocolate bar. Well, it's always a pleasure hearing from you guys. See you soon.
Thank you very much, Alberto, for both of your messages that you sent us over the summer. Any comments, Reza?
Yeah, g'day, mate.
G'day. G'day.
Alberto, I hear you're going up a little bit at the end of the sentences. That's very Australian. You're getting the accent a bit. Have you noticed him going up a little bit at the end?
I have noticed him going up at the end.
Yeah.
A bit like you do in Belfast.
Yeah, but he's doing it the Australian way. It's I can't explain it, but it's different, isn't it? We go up in Belfast, but Australians also go up at the end, mate, but in a different way.
So, Alberto, you're getting an Australian accent. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about your Australianisms? And yes, good point that Australians do abbreviate almost everything. Cigarette becomes ciggy, avo becomes avocado, avocado becomes avo, Barbie, Chrissy is Christmas, chocolate biscuit is chocky bicky. So lots of abbreviations. Be careful, Alberto, you mispronounce those two words, abbreviation and abbreviate. Abbreviation's quite difficult. There are so many syllables. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 syllables in abbreviation. The strong syllable is syllable number 4. So it's abbreviation. And the verb to abbreviate, to make something shorter, to abbreviate. The video that Alberto referred to, How to Speak Australian, I did watch. I enjoyed it very, very much. It's a very well-made video. It's called Abbreviate Everything. And there's a link to that video in the show notes that you can find. Reza, where can they find the show notes to this episode?
You can find the show notes at inglespodcast.com/281 for this episode. Because this is episode 281. Wow, it's a lot of episodes. inglespodcast.com/281.
And Alberto also mentioned episode 274, which is an episode we did with our friend Agada on vegans and vegetarians. And he mentioned Marmite and Vegemite, both made of yeast extract, levadura de cerveza. I agree with you, Alberto, with anything that's an imitation of the original. Vegan chocolate, no, not the real thing. Anything that's not the real thing for me is just not good enough.
I don't know. Have you ever had chocolate made out of carob?
Yes, and it's not bad, but it's not chocolate. It's chocolate, like non-alcoholic beer. I mean, why do it?
But it's good. I mean, if you don't think of it as chocolate, like in a dessert made out of carob, it's a nice tasting thing which tastes quite similar to chocolate. I quite like the taste of it.
Okay, I think we'll agree to differ on that. Any more comments on Alberto's messages?
No, just cheers, mate, and keep it up.
Next, we have a voice message from Eurico, who asks us what he can do in London and Belfast.
Hello, Reza and Greg. My name is Eurico. I'm from Brazil. Congratulations again about your fantastic job. My English has improved every day. I've been studying English for a while. As you know, I'm going to London for my first exchange. Could you tell me, Reza and Greg, what to do in my free time in London and Belfast? Thank you.
Always a pleasure to hear from our friend Eurico. I hope that we are not too late with our advice on what you can see in London and Belfast. I can't remember when you're going, but I hope this episode will help you.
Okay, so London, we've already talked about, right? Eurico, just go to englishpodcast.com/104. That was our episode on 10 things to do in London. So that's already done. Now Belfast.
What can people do in Belfast? This is where I'm going to defer to you because this is your hometown. So what would you recommend?
Well, we worked on these notes together, Eurico, and Craig came up with some very good ideas. He's done his homework. He came up with some very good ideas about things to do in Belfast. He was spot on. One of the things he suggested, and I agree with him totally, is to go to the Titanic Belfast Centre. We've got links to useful web pages to all these suggestions we have. You'll see them in the show notes. So it's titanicbelfast.com is the website. As you can guess, it's a visitor centre which is dedicated to the Titanic, the famous ship, the building of it, and also the shipwreck, the sinking of the famous doomed ship. What does doomed mean, Craig?
Oh, doomed is a very negative word. It means bad things are going to happen, or if the Titanic was doomed from the beginning, then it was obvious the end was going to be bad. Very negative, very pessimistic, and very bad. But did the Titanic leave from Belfast, or was it built in Belfast?
Well, as you can imagine, we've got a Titanic Belfast Centre in Belfast, so we know a thing or two about the Titanic. It left on its first commercial journey from the English port of Southampton, which was an extremely important port and still is. And it was registered in Liverpool, as many boats were. And the reason it was registered in Liverpool is because the owner of the shipping company, White Star Line, Mr. Bruce Ismay, was from Liverpool. So he liked to register a lot of his boats in Liverpool. Of course, these days, most ships get registered in Panama. Have you noticed?
Yeah.
Yeah. Even though the ship itself has no connection with Panama, it often is registered in Panama for tax reasons. It's cheaper and more convenient to do it there. But 100 years ago, many British ship owners still registered their ships in the UK. So the Titanic was registered in Liverpool. So if you've seen the film, when it goes down at the end, you see the bottom of the ship going down and it says Titanic Liverpool just at the very end going down. But in fact, the Titanic was built in Belfast, not in Liverpool.
Okay.
So it was registered in Liverpool. It started its first commercial journey from Southampton, but it was built in Belfast. That's why we know a lot about it in Belfast, because we're very proud of the building of it.
So on its maiden voyage, maiden means the first voyage, the initial voyage, the initial journey, it left from Southampton.
Yep.
And then did it go to Belfast? So
Well,
it just
on its first commercial journey.
Commercial journey, because they had to sail it from Belfast to Southampton.
So that would have been actually its first rail journey, but without passengers.
Okay.
So just with the crew and I suppose a few other people, it sailed virtually empty. Just the crew, that's the people who work on a boat or a plane, from Belfast to Southampton.
And then when it actually did its first voyage, when it sank, past of sink is sank, it went from Southampton to, well, it was trying to get to New York.
To the bottom of the Atlantic,
yeah.
But not directly to the bottom of the Atlantic. In fact, it's even more complicated than that. I found out an interesting fact just yesterday when I was checking my facts that it was supposed to stop in Liverpool on its way to Southampton.
That's what I thought.
It was supposed to, but it didn't.
Yeah.
At the last minute, those plans had to be changed. So its planned stop in Liverpool never happened. So it went straight from Belfast to Southampton. But then it started its journey with the passengers from Southampton. It then docked. To dock is a verb as well as a place, a dock, where the ship comes to a stop beside the land. It docked in Cherbourg in France. That's not a very long journey. In a few hours, you can get from Southampton to Cherbourg. It's much, much further to go from Belfast to Southampton. Southampton to Cherbourg is not very far. So it went from Southampton to Cherbourg, took on more passengers there, and then a lot of people forget that it docked as planned in Cork in Ireland, not Belfast.
Okay.
In
Cork is in the south
the
of Ireland.
south of Ireland. So it took no passengers from Belfast. It just started there because that's where it was built.
Okay.
And it stopped in Cork, took on passengers there, and then made its way across the Atlantic, where, of course, it went down in the middle and never did get to its destination of New York.
There's also an expression that you can use to go down like the Titanic, which is a euphemism. For example, if you try to tell a joke and nobody laughs, you could say, oh, well, that went down like the Titanic. If something wasn't successful, you can say it failed. Oh, it went down like the Titanic.
Some of you might be thinking, why was the Titanic built in Belfast? I don't think of Belfast these days for shipbuilding. No, neither do I. But at the time, about 100 years ago, the shipyard in Belfast, a company called Harland and Wolff, it was the biggest in the world, believe it or not. And the city of Belfast at that time, about 100 years ago, was an extremely fast-growing, important industrial city in the British Empire. Not at all now. But it was then. It was a more prosperous city then than it is now.
Do they still make ships there?
Well, it's funny you should ask me that. Very sadly, just a few weeks before we're recording this podcast, in August 2019, it was announced that the shipyard had gone bankrupt.
Really? Last month?
Just a month ago.
That's a coincidence.
And they're going to close. And this is a really, really bad blow for the city. A blow is like when you're hit by something, yeah,
A setback.
a setback. It's something which has affected all of the people of Belfast a lot, because the shipyard, where they built the Titanic, as you can imagine, a very symbolic place.
Yeah.
Even today, when you can't be in Belfast without noticing the cranes, gruas of the shipyard. They really stand out. That means they're very, very visible. They're these big, big, big yellow cranes, and they have the letters H and W, Harland and Wolff, written on them, and you can see them from miles away, because these cranes were built to move around huge ships in the docks. And for quite a few years, they haven't been doing much work. They kind of stand idle, but they're really, really visible, these cranes with H and W. So you can't not think of shipbuilding just by looking at Belfast. You see the big shipyard cranes. So it's a big, big blow for the city that after all these years, the once biggest shipyard in the world that built the Titanic is going to close. So I can't exaggerate enough how important the shipbuilding history of Belfast is. Really important.
So this museum is very strongly recommended. People should visit this if they're in Belfast. Are there any markets that people could visit?
There are, but I won't lie. I'll tell you the truth straight away. If you're Spanish, or if you've ever been in Spain, and you've seen a Mercado Central in Valencia, or even the Boqueria in Barcelona, you will not be impressed by the market in Belfast. But it's pretty hard to get a better market than El Mercado Central in Valencia anywhere in the world. Let's be honest, it's an amazing place. But we do have our little market called St. George's Market. It's not very big, the variety of food on offer is not very wide compared to Valencia or La Boqueria, but it's a very attractive old building, and it has been a market since 1604. So wow, 400 years as a market. That's a long history.
But the food isn't from 1604.
Hopefully.
It's probably fresher than that.
400 years continuously a market in the same site, St. George's. That's a pretty long time. But I wouldn't say you'll be that impressed by the food, but it does have some very impressive crafts and antiques on a Saturday and Sunday. Interesting artisan, unique things on sale. So I would recommend it for that.
Also, I think it's always a good idea to go and visit markets in cities that you visit, not only because they are usually wonderful photographic opportunities and taking video and photos of markets, but you see how people live. I mean, I'm sure local people shop there and they go there with their families, and you can get a good idea. There's lots of movement and noise. And we've had this expression before, hustle and bustle. When something gets busy, when there are lots of people together, there's lots of hustle and bustle. So markets are wonderful for tourist visits.
But I don't want to deceive Ulrico right from the start. I'll say London, Belfast, you'll be more impressed by Camden Market. I'm not going to lie to you. But if you're in Belfast, check out St. George's Market.
What about Belfast City Hall? Now, I saw some photos on the internet of the City Hall, and it does look like a very beautiful building.
It
very
is
impressive.
In my opinion, it's a stunning building. It's far more spectacular than you would expect for a city that size. Belfast really isn't that big. Depending on how you measure Belfast, there are different ways. It's a bit ambiguous, but it's absolutely at the biggest, it's no more than about 450,000 people, but it might be no bigger than about 350,000, depends how you measure it. So not a very big city, but its city hall would be a place worthy of any kind of major European city. It's a very beautiful building. Not surprising, because many of the workmen who built that city hall are the very same people who built the Titanic. The same workmen.
And it's still standing, hasn't fallen down.
No, well, that isn't at the bottom of the Atlantic yet.
Can you go inside? Visitors can go inside and see the interior?
Yep, you can get a guided tour. I think you have to pay. I can't remember how much, but it's not very much. But it's very spectacular. Only the finest quality, top quality, really good material was used because, as I said, at that time, Belfast was a very prosperous city. It was riding the back of a period of growth. That's why they built the Titanic there. And in fact, at one stage, the Lord Mayor, El Alcalde, of Belfast, round about the time of the Titanic, was related to the family that owned the Titanic. So it all kind of connects. The kind of rich and powerful people who were involved in the building of the Titanic also were involved in running the hall. So not surprising, they got the same workmen, and it was top quality stuff. Okay. So it really is worth a visit.
Sounds good. What other places would you recommend?
Well, if you want to just relax outside, Botanic
If it's
Gardens,
not raining.
If it's not raining, yeah. Which, let's be honest, half of the time at least it is in Belfast. I won't lie about that. Summer, winter, it doesn't really matter. It rains all year. You could go to the Botanic Gardens. As I said earlier, that there's links to useful websites giving you information about this in the show notes.
And the show notes can be found at inglespodcast.com/281.
The Botanic Gardens are definitely worth a visit, not only for the gardens, but because they're in a very nice area. Near at the gardens, around the gardens, is the university area. The university in the centre of Belfast is called Queen's University. The Botanic Gardens are in the Queen's University quarter, so there's nice architecture in general around there, and there's lots of students moving about, so it's quite a good kind of entertainment and leisure area. And also, right inside the Botanic Gardens, you can find the Ulster Museum, I'll talk about that more in a minute. But what has the Botanic Gardens got? Well, apart from plenty of grass and green area, it's got some interesting breeds of plants. Like most of the interesting, famous features of Belfast, it was built in Victorian times, the time of Queen Victoria, because that was really a good time for Belfast, very prosperous. So Victorian explorers were very keen on bringing back exotic plants from their travels. So they brought them back, and there's a good variety in the Botanic Gardens of Belfast of unusual plants. There's even a tropical ravine. So, if you come from a tropical area, if you come from, let's say, I don't know, Central America, and you feel a bit homesick, you could go to the Botanic Gardens and pop in, that means just go inside for a minute, to the tropical ravine. So they keep this area specially heated at a higher temperature.
And they've got tropical plants and trees and flora inside, yeah?
It's quite interesting.
Okay.
And then, as I say, you've got the museum right beside it. Maybe Craig can tell you a little bit about the museum, because if I go on, you're going to get bored listening to my voice.
No, I don't. I can't imagine anyone getting bored listening to your voice. So I've never been to Belfast. Reza hasn't invited me yet. I'm waiting for him to invite me.
Oh, that's not true. That's not true. I have. He just hasn't come yet.
I know it's definitely one of the cities I'd love to see. So I haven't been to the museum, and to be honest, museums are not my cup of tea. I'm not really a museum person unless it's raining a lot and there's nothing else to do. But the Ulster Museum in Belfast does have an interesting mix of ancient Celtic and more modern Irish history on display. So you can see an ancient mummy, an Egyptian mummy. That's the thing with all the bandages, the white bandage around the body. And also there are some artifacts from the shipwreck of the Girona. The Girona. This particular ship sank off the Irish coast in 1588 after the defeat of the Spanish Armada.
Yeah, sorry about that, Spanish people. Disculpas.
Yeah, and we apologise for that. So yeah, that's. Have you been inside? Have you seen that?
Yeah.
Is it impressive?
It is quite impressive, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So there, you can go and see that. And there's also a 77-metre long hand-woven and hand-embroidered Game of Thrones. Yes, Game of Thrones tapestry. A tapestry is a cloth that's handmade, and when you weave, W-E-A-V-E, when you weave together or put together material and wool, lana, then it's hand woven. It's hand woven. And embroider is to make a design or a pattern in material, in tela. And if that's done by hand, it's hand embroidered. So you can see some wonderful Game of Thrones hand embroidered and hand woven artifacts in this museum.
If you want a kind of sneak preview, that means you get to see something before you actually go and really do it. In the show notes, I put a link to the Game of Thrones tapestry so you can kind of get an idea online. As Craig said earlier, you'll find the show notes at inglespodcast.com/281.
And we should tell you that the museum is free. So if you are in Belfast and you can't really go to the Botanic Gardens and you walk around the market because it's raining, why not go to the museum?
I mentioned that the museum and the Botanic Gardens are in the Queen's University Quarter. There's another interesting quarter in Belfast called the Cathedral Quarter. It's called that because it's near St Anne's Cathedral, which is the main Anglican cathedral in the centre of Belfast. And this area is what we would call up and coming. So recently, not long ago, it wasn't very popular. But now it is, and it's growing all the time. It's up and coming. It's a newly renovated area. It was a little bit abandoned for quite a few decades, but now money has been spent on making it better. So popular bars, restaurants, and clubs and things like that have recently opened up. So for a nice meal or a dance or a drink or something like that, I would recommend the Cathedral Quarter.
And we spoke about Game of Thrones earlier. There's a tour you can book from Belfast that takes you to the Giant's Causeway. What's the connection with Game of Thrones and the Giant's Causeway, Reza?
Yes, well as filming or shooting, rodar, much of the series of Game of Thrones near Belfast in studios not far from Belfast, many of the outdoor locations used in the filming are also dotted around. That means in many different places. They're dotted around various places in Northern Ireland, including the Giant's Causeway. The Giant's Causeway is a kind of area of outstanding natural beauty. In fact, it's a World Heritage Site.
It's on the coast, isn't it?
It's on the north coast. So that's not in Belfast, but it's about an 80 minutes drive away from Belfast. And
How long?
80 minutes.
80 minutes. 18?
80.
80 minutes.
Yeah.
Just over an hour.
Just over an hour, yeah. So you can easily go from Belfast to the Giant's Causeway or many other locations which have been used in Game of Thrones. That's why in the Ulster Museum they have the Game of Thrones tapestry.
Okay.
That's why it's there, because Belfast is a very important place for Game of Thrones. I know, lots of it has also been filmed in Spain and Croatia and several other areas, I know. But the main studio they use is near Belfast, and they've also used many locations there. And why a tapestry? Because it reflects Belfast's history in the museum of textiles. Apart from shipbuilding, the other big industry in Belfast was textiles. Above all, making things with linen, lino in Spanish. Belfast, Ireland in general, used to be a very, very important producer of linen textiles. Not anymore, sadly. But to make the Game of Thrones tapestry, they used linen produced in one of the very last factories, which remains in operation in Northern Ireland. And they did it there by hand and embroidered it by hand. So it kind of connects up Belfast history with the Game of Thrones series.
But if a tourist were to look for a handmade linen shirt in Belfast, they probably wouldn't find one, right? It's not an industry that's current much.
They'd have to go to the museum for that.
Yeah. Now, a very famous personality out of Belfast is George Best. I don't know if you've heard that name before. He was a very famous footballer internationally and nationally in the UK. Tell us a bit about George Best, Reza.
Well, I'm sure some of you have heard of him because he's often said to be the first world superstar of football. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean he was the best, but he was possibly the first footballer to be really, really famous. Before him, footballers didn't become really, really famous. But George Best arrived at just the right time, kind of the 60s, the swinging 60s, when fashion and music and all of that kind of became more important. There was TV, it's quite a new thing, and people saw all this glamour and all of that. And people have always liked football in the UK and around the world. And George Best happened to be one of the best footballers at that time. So he became what we would call now a superstar because of his footballing talents.
This would have been in the 60s, right?
The 60s, yeah. I think his
late 60s.
Well, his career, I think, started in the early 60s, but by the late 60s, yeah, he'd become really famous. In fact, he was sometimes referred to as the fifth Beatle because of the Beatles at that time, the 60s, and kind of everybody had heard of him. And he loved the attention, He was a young man getting all this attention. He thought it was great.
In fact, even Pelé said that George Best was the greatest footballer in the world. And that's Brazil's Pelé saying that.
What about that, Eurico? Surprised to hear that from Pelé?
Yeah.
What's more, where do you hear this, Eurico and everybody? I have a quotation from Pelé. He said, talking about George Best, "To me, he never looked like a European. He was a Latin player, a Brazilian player, he said. So, according to Pele, George Best was a Brazilian player. I read up on that a little bit. I did my research. And what he meant by that was his style of playing was very Brazilian, very creative, more about the flair, the creation, the new ideas, rather than the kind of strict, practiced, regimented kind of Germanic way of playing, that kind of flair, that stylish way that the Brazilians have of playing.
Spontaneity, yeah. In fact, apparently you can actually stay in George Best's family home where he grew up during his formative years. Is that true? You can actually pay to stay in the house? Right?
Yeah. We've included in our show notes a link to the website where you can book a stay in the very modest family home where George Best grew up. So if you're a real football nut and you want to sleep in George Best's childhood bedroom, you can.
I wonder if there'll be any beer in the fridge there, because George Best, as good as he was, did have a reputation for his taste for alcohol. And speaking of alcohol, you can visit pubs in Belfast. Now, if you go from one pub to another pub, to another pub, to another pub, and you keep visiting different pubs the same day, the same night, and drinking in each pub, that's called a pub crawl. Crawl. Crawl is gatiar, like a baby. So if you crawled from one pub to the next, you can actually do that as a tourist. Reza, have you got a favourite pub or bar in Belfast, one that you like drinking at, that you recommend to the listeners?
There are several good places, and I've put a link into the show notes, but my personal favourite is the very well-known The Crown Bar. It's an old pub. It goes back to 1826, and it still has most of the original furnishings. Can you believe that?
I thought you were going to say most of the original peanuts and crisps.
It might be a bit off by now.
And sandwiches from the 1800s.
No, not food, furnishings. So I'm talking about things like it has wood, very fancy, very elaborate wood, carved by Italian artisans who were the best around at that time.
So again, that's from the time you mentioned before that was very prosperous for the city, where there was a lot of money coming in, yeah?
Actually, no. The Crown even predates that.
Wow.
Yeah, so I suppose this is before it really took off. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the Crown's even before kind of the Titanic times and all that. It's 1826, so I guess the city was just kind of starting to grow at that stage. Well, for whatever reason, the owners had plenty of cash to splash around on the furnishings, and they spared no expense. They got in these Italian artisans. They put in private snugs. How would we describe a snug, Craig?
I'm not really sure. Is that where there's kind of a little corner of the pub where a couple can kiss and be intimate with one another?
A couple or friends, a small group of 3 or 4 get together and just talk. Yeah, with doors that close in this case.
Oh, right. Kind of a private room.
Yeah, semi-private. So kind of like those doors that open, flap open and shut like in an old-fashioned public toilet, very flimsy doors. But they give you a little bit of privacy. Oh. Yeah, so there are corners where they have these doors that close. So they can fit a group of about 4 or 5 people.
I wonder if in the 19th century it was a place where prostitutes would be.
It was, and the pub was.
Yeah.
I can tell you as a fact.
So they'd have some privacy in a little cubicle, a little room.
I can tell you as a fact. No, I wasn't actually there. I can't say it as an absolute fact. I have never contracted a prostitute in the 19th century, I have to say. In 1826. Or the 20th, or the 21st.
Well, I was going to say, have you in this century?
In any century, but believe me, I wasn't alive in 1826 or 1926. I'm hoping to be alive in 2026. But history has it. It is said that, yes, sometimes those snugs were used to contract the services of prostitutes.
Female company.
Not to carry out the acts there, but to seal the deal, to agree the terms and
To
conditions.
seal the deal.
Yeah, it is said that those
Hacer el
snugs
trato.
were used for that. So ladies of the night looking for business went into the snugs, and perhaps a gentleman who was prepared to part with his money agreed to the business transaction there, and then they left the Crown Bar to go somewhere more convenient to carry out the transaction.
I'm also guessing that in the height of Belfast's popularity with shipbuilding and industry, it will be a place where gambling and prostitutes would be very popular because lots of workers, laborers. So, yeah.
All of that. But you've really got to go to this pub, even if you don't have a drink. Yeah, don't worry. There's no more prostitution these days that I know of. Not since at least about 100 years ago, happening in and around that bar. But you've just got to go just to see the building, the architecture. You've got these private snugs. You've got hanging gas lamps, the original gas lamps still in use, stained glass. Now, what's stained glass? Basically, stained glass is like a window.
Not clean.
Could be that, couldn't
Con
it?
manchas.
Somebody say, oh, con mancha. That's what it literally means. But of course, it doesn't really mean that. A stained glass window is window or glass which has been hand painted for a special effect. Very typical of churches in
And
Britain and
cathedrals,
Ireland.
yeah.
And that's why they did it. In Ireland, there's a very, very common theme of making pubs look like churches. And the Crown Bar is no exception. In many ways, it looks like a church inside. The snogs and other little things, they look like confessionals. They look like the area where you go to confess your sin. The stained glass window with very kind of spectacular things like griffins, griffins and lions and things like that on the stained glass window. So it's very spectacular architecture.
And you mentioned another place, Kelly's Cellars. Is that another popular drinking hole?
Yes, and it's even older than the Crown Bar, but it doesn't look so spectacular. But you go there for the atmosphere. There's a good atmosphere there. And it has a lot of history. In Kelly Cellars, over the centuries, well-known revolutionaries have met and plotted there. People who later became famous or imprisoned or executed, always plotting the overthrow of the English occupiers. Kelly Cellars was a good place to meet to do that.
And speaking of criminals and people who go to prison, there's a famous jail called Crumlin Road Jail. Crumlin Road Jail. Again, links in the show notes. It's a tourist attraction, but why would a tourist want to go to see a prison?
Well, I've visited a few prisons in my time in England and Dublin. I just think they're interesting places. But I think Crumlin Road is extra interesting because some of the most dangerous people in the history of Britain and Ireland have been there. People who are kind of well-trained paramilitary terrorists who've killed a lot of people or planted bombs.
Because they were fighting the British government.
Yes, but not. I'm not just talking about since like the 1960s, even way before that, because it's a very old prison. Even before the Troubles, as we call them in Belfast, which started in the 60s, even from before that, there were famous people such as Eamon de Valera. Funny sounding, sounds Spanish, eh? Well, Eamon de Valera was the former president of Ireland. But before that, he was held as a prisoner in that jail.
He was a terrorist.
They considered him a terrorist or a troublemaker or something like that. He later became president of Ireland. Martin McGuinness, who was in the IRA, it's a known fact, which is no secret.
And there's no connection to the Guinness beer, by the way.
No, this is McGuinness. What's more. And other famous people. So yes, paramilitaries on both sides of the religious divide, both nationalist Catholics or loyalist Protestants. So some very dangerous people have been held in that jail. But now you can go and visit it. They do guided tours.
So it's not a functioning prison. No prisoners are inside.
No, not since the last 15 or 20 years.
Very cool. So we hope this episode has given you some ideas if you are about to visit Belfast, like Eureka, or perhaps you're planning in the short term to go to Northern Ireland. And we'd love to hear if you've already been and there's a place that you would like to recommend to other listeners that we haven't mentioned here. Please let us know. Reza, how can people get in touch with us?
Well, our preferred way, if you're brave enough, go ahead and speak to us. So send us a voice message on speakpipe.com/Inglés podcast.
Or you could send us an email to me at craig@inglespodcast.com or emails to Reza at belfastreza@gmail.com. Before we go, Reza, if a person was going to Belfast just for 3 days, could you think of 3 things, maybe the 3 things that we've mentioned, or anything that you would recommend? In other words, people going just for a very short time, what would be the 3 places they should definitely not miss in Belfast?
I think the Titanic Centre Museum, for one. Also, I would say, can I have 2 for one? The Botanic Gardens and Ulster Museum, because the museum's in the Botanic Gardens.
Okay.
So definitely there. And if I can count that as one,
pub.
My third one is the pub crawl.
Yeah, the pub crawl.
Definitely.
Drink lots of beer, go and visit those nooks and crannies and places and seats in the pub. And have a great time in Belfast. Please let us know if you have been or if you're going, what your experience was like. Before we go, we want to say thank you to the Patreon supporters who have joined us this summer. Thank you very much for your support. Reza, who joined us this summer to support our Patreon program?
Our most recent sponsors are Julen Renteria Antuniano, Oscar Sanchez Molina, Maria Luz Lopez Comfort 1.4, great name, Eduard Fonseca, Rox Cole, Nestor Stengel, Fernando del Cerro, Luis Antonio Echeverría Díaz, Enrique Delgado, Jesus Acevedo, Francisca Trujillo, María Alejandra Maldonado, José Luis Ortega Morales, Eder Massa, and Patricia Conde.
Thank you very much to all of you new patrons and, of course, patrons who support us every month. If you'd like to join our Patreon program for a minimum of $1 per month, you do get instant access to transcriptions lovingly transcribed by Angelica. The address for that is patreon.com/Inglespodcast.
Craig, what's on next week's episode?
We have had a listener question during the summer to speak about the Canary Islands, las Islas Canarias. So if you'd like to find out about those lovely Spanish islands, or if you actually live there, please join us next week. And until then, thanks for listening this week. It's goodbye from Reza.
And bye-bye from Craig.
The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.